Our final speaker will use his decades of design experience and research and teach us ways to make better design decisions, whether through a balance of our own experience and in-depth research, or simply by knowing when to trust our gut. Get ready to know yourself and prepare to become a better designer. Please welcome Jared Spool.
Hey, let's make some noise if today's been a great day. Fantastic. I realize that I am the thing between you and the closing party. I am also completely aware that you are the thing between me and the closing party. So let's get started here. I want to talk to you today about something we do all the time: make decisions. And to do that, I want to start with, what do I want to start with? There we go. I want to start with this, Grey's Anatomy. Actually, not this, Grey's Anatomy. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to this book, because you may not know this, but this book, written by Henry Gray, illustrated by John Carter, is, other than the Bible, the longest book to be in continuous publication. First come out in 1858, and it changed medicine. Medicine was, before Grey's Anatomy, there was no standard of understanding about the parts of the human body. People had different names for different things. There were all sorts of things that never had any name whatsoever. There were no definition between what the separation between the pancreas and the colon was. There was all sorts of different debate about what the body was. And Grey's Anatomy changed this, completely changed the way that we think about medicine. And it did that by establishing a common vocabulary. That's what anatomy is. It's basically a common description, a study of the structure, of the inner workings of something. And the reason I bring this up is because in design, we're sort of at the same sort of place that we have been with medicine was back in the 1850s. In that we have debates over what things are. What is flat design, or what is skeuomorphism, and where does it start and stop? And all these things happen. But interestingly enough, those debates go to things we don't talk about, the things that we aren't thinking of. And I started to think about, well, what's the inner working of the design process? What is it that we're trying to do? And at the core of the design process is the idea of a decision. What we do every day is we make decisions. And so I started to get interested in thinking about design decisions. What are, in fact, the internal workings of design decisions? Now, this is the New York Times homepage, and the number of decisions that the team had to make in order to create this page goes into the thousands. Everything from the overall layout of the site down to, how big the text was, where the images would be, whether the links would be blue or not. Every single one of those decisions was made very deliberately, very thoughtfully. And it produced this result. Interestingly, news sites basically have the same decisions, no matter what the news sites are. So we can compare this site to, say, this site. This is a site called Havenworks. And they, too, decided to make decisions the same way the New York Times did, but on different things. The result has turned out to be absolutely stunning. I mean, one of my favorite things is, if we scroll down here, we can see that they have this sort of 5-column grid, which becomes a 4-column grid, then a 3-column grid, then a 2-column grid, and then it goes down to a 1-column grid. See where the scroll bar is, because in a second, boom. There's a decision for you. Or we can look at something like the Etsy website. Etsy also is an e-commerce site, and the team there has had to make thousands of decisions about how to do things. And Etsy's got a particular way that they market because they are selling crafts, so they want to make sure that the fact that it's an individual craftsman who's selling this is a key part of their market. But one of the other things they want to communicate is that the prices are very good because you're dealing directly with the craftsperson. So they have to balance the picture and the price and the artist's information all very gently. Now, compare that to this website, which is a Norwegian e-commerce site. And again, same sort of decisions, but they've made them very differently. They've had different outcomes, and they've come up with a different response. And that's the thing, right? What we have here are different approaches to dealing with the same decisions. Some of these produce a good result. Some of these produce a not so good result. I'll let you decide which one's which. But what's interesting about this is it has to do with the decisions they made. And I'm going to guess that nobody making these decisions set out to produce something crappy. They set out to produce something great. So they didn't know how they were making the decisions. And this is the core of the problem. We make thousands of decisions every day, but what we don't know is whether we're producing something like the New York Times site or something like the Havenworks site. How do we know the outcomes of our decisions? How do we make sure we make the right decisions? This was the subject of a multi-year research project that we embarked on. Now, the way we start research projects, we start every research project with a celebrity death match. And in this particular case, we were matching up the folks at 37 Signals, Jason Fried and his group of merry men producing the Basecamp product and other things, and the writing against 37 Signals against a dude named Don Norman. Don Norman is the guy who coined the phrase user experience, and he has been working in this field for many, many years. And what brought us to this particular death match was actually this article in Wired magazine. In this article, they described the way that 37 Signals approaches their projects. And it's a very sort of interesting approach of how they build what they want to build. And in that, there was a quote that said, "We're not designing for others, we're designing for ourselves." Now, if you know anything about the liturgy of human-computer interaction and the science of human factors, this is a very controversial sentence, because the entire science of studying users is to make sure that you don't design for yourselves, you design for your users. But these guys were designing very much for themselves. That was their philosophy. And this upset Don Norman. He ended up writing a piece in which he said, "I've tried their products, and although they have admirable qualities, they've never quite met my needs. Close is not good enough. After reading the article, I understand why. The developers are arrogant and completely unsympathetic to the people who use their products." It was that paragraph that got my attention. Frankly, it was the fact that Don Norman called somebody else arrogant that got my attention. And it was this that made me really think about this dichotomy. The fact is that 37 Signals has been really successful. They have done a fantastic job. And they have been able to take their products and make a lot of money. Theoretically, that shouldn't happen. You should not succeed by just designing for yourself. Yet they did. And so we started to look and try and figure out what this is. And we actually had to give it a name because no name existed before it. And we called it SelfDesign. And it turns out that SelfDesign works really well under two very specific conditions. The first condition is that you have to have a a group of users who are just like you, right? They have to be a large enough group to support your products, to support your business. But if you can do that, if you can find a group of users who are just like you, then self-design will work, because anything you build for yourself, you're building for them. But the other condition is that you have to use the thing you build all the time, just like your users. You can't just be using it in test mode and pushing it out the door. You have to use it for the purpose it was intended. Because if there's anything about using it for the purposes intended that's frustrating, you're going to hit it, and it's going to frustrate you. And because you wrote it, you're going to fix it. If you're not using it, you won't hit those frustrating bits, and you won't find that. So those two conditions have to exist. So that's self-design. This is not self-design. This is a gas pump near my house. And I love this gas pump because of its design. I use this gas pump every week. One of the things I love about it is the sheer number of arrows they have provided in the interface. It's just, the variety is stunning. But how do you get started with this thing? Well, there's this thing that says start, which points to this thing that says push to start, which seems to want you to push this thing that says nothing. But then there's this little display down here, which seems to suggest that you want to push to the left, which looks like it wants you to push over here, but in fact, it wants you to push over there. Now, the deal with this is that this is not self-design. There isn't somebody who said, oh, this is the pump I want to use. This is something else. As is this design. This is the Wi-Fi screen I got at a hotel in California. And I love this screen because it talks about design in such a great way. One of the things I love about it is the radio buttons for which you have to choose something, but you only get one choice. Such as the service period, which is full day, 24 hours, $0.00. You have to choose this. It will not let you go forward without it. Or connection speed, 1 megabit for $0.00. Or this option, which actually gives you two choices. You can choose to register for standard internet service, or you can register for public IP for VPN access internet service for an additional $0.00. But my favorite part, I will admit, is if for some reason you arrived at this screen and you did not feel welcomed enough, you can request the welcome message. At one point, we had people in our lab, and we were watching them book flights, and we were on the American Airlines flight, and we watched someone go through and book a flight and go through all 6 steps of booking the flight. And when they suddenly got an error message that said, invalid state error, to which the participant in the study said, I thought Massachusetts was a valid state. But I love this error message because it's just so wacky. It says, unfortunately, we are unable to continue due to one of the following. Too much time has elapsed between submitting entries. Multiple browser windows have been opened. Okay, but not here. Incorrect use of the browser's back button. How many ways are there to use the browser's back button? Sir, always the center. Always press the center. I like the last one. Attempting to use expired bookmark pages. Have you checked your bookmark pages? Many of them have expired. You should always check the expiration date on your bookmark pages. It's like yogurt. How else do you know it's gone bad? But the worst of this was this sentence at the bottom. It says, any changes that were attempted may be lost. Please start over. Now, the person had gone through 15 minutes of booking their reservation. They got this error message, and if they had followed that advice, they would have gone through another 15 minutes and booked a second reservation. The reservation had actually gone through. This error message was not telling them that they didn't go through. It was telling them that the browser was confused. And this is not self-design. Nobody at American Airlines said, this is exactly the error message I'd want to get. That didn't happen. This is something else. We call it unintentional design. It's unintentional design because what that error message was really about was that there was some disconnect between what their middleware application that handles the communication with their legacy mainframes was dealing with and what their front-end app server logic was telling them. They couldn't figure that problem out, so they put up this inscrutable error message with all the possible things they thought it could be, none of which were the things it actually was. And this wasn't because someone said this is the ideal experience. This was said because we have to tell the user we've had some error we don't understand. They were focused on the system. And that's what unintentional design is. You're focusing on the system or on the business process or something else, and whatever design emerges, that's the design that happens. And it turns out that unintentional design is actually a valid way to design sometimes. Not very often. But there are times when we just don't need to give it thought, like a patch that we might give to a service person to install in an industrial device as a trained professional. They don't necessarily need this to be so usable that anybody can use it. They just need to be told how to use it and go off and do it. So there are instances where unintentional design can happen and it's fine. But what this really means is that there are different types of design, and we can start to classify things like this, Ling's Cars. Ling's Cars is a brilliant piece of design. It just gets better. It is obviously, to some extent, self-design, because Ling has definitely got her character in this, and she has built this thing. But there are so many just wonderful things, like I love the bouncing cars. They are one of my favorite elements of this. And the deal with this whole thing is that it's someone intentionally did this. This was not an accident. But yet it was focused on not the user's experience. So we can sort of divide these things up. We can say, okay, we've got self-design, and then we've got unintentional design. And we can even choose which one we're going to use. Maybe we start with unintentional design, and we start getting complaints, people saying, well, it feels clumsy. I don't understand why I'm getting these messages. So then we say, okay, well, it's too complex. It's not easy enough to use. Let's start with self-design. And actually build something that we find easy to use and not complex. So we can make that choice and move on. Well, it turns out that it's not just these two types of design that are out there. There's a third type, which happens when we are having to design for something that we won't use, right? Because we won't use everything our users use. So for that, we can go to something like Genius Design. This is Old Dominion University's website, and it has something in common with Chatham Hall, a prep school in North Carolina's website, and it also has something to do in common with Virginia Tech and the Imperial College of London before Dominion 7 got to it. And what these all have in common is that they were designed by this guy's firm, the David Poteet at New City Media. And what is interesting about this is that New City Media has made it a practice to do university websites. They did lots of them. And they got so good at it that they could start predicting what they would see when they would go out and do their workshops and their research and all the things that happened. And they could start to bring that information in. They started by doing those research activities, but over time they realized that most of the time they could actually guess what was happening. And this has a name. This is called genius design. Genius design is when you get so good at something you can predict the answers to the questions you're going to have. You can predict what you're going to see. Now, it doesn't happen all the time. New City recently did a school for nursing where the students come at night. And that was the first time they'd done something which was a part-time education experience. And as a result, what they found was that their questions weren't answered around certain areas. Because, for instance, prospective students were trying to figure out if the nursing school requires that you do internships, how do you work your day job and then do internships as a nurse in order to get your internship credit? What is that happening? And that was content they'd never had to produce before, and they didn't know that they were going to need to produce that content. So that was new for them. But most of the time, they know what to do, and that's what genius design is. And genius design is is the third type of design, but at some point, you have to research something that you've never seen or done before. And that is what we call activity-focused design. Now, let's say we were going to create a system to be used in a hospital by doctors and nurses to order blood tests. CBC, Chem7, the standard sort of round of blood tests. Well, what we'd want to do if we were doing activity-focused design is we would go into the hospital and we'd start to study who uses this system. We'd find that the doctors and the nurses are ordering the labs and looking at the results, and that there's a lab tech who does the lab stuff, and there's a manager in the lab whose job it is to make sure that all the tests are being done in a reasonable time frame. And we can go and look at the activities of each of these people, and we can map the activities to the specific users, and we can see what their relationships are, and we can design for those specific activities. And the thing about this is that this is independent as to whether the design will end up on some sort of mobile tablet or it's just going to be on your standard laptop. We're not at that level of decision-making yet, but we're going off and doing the research to find out what the tasks are, what the things the users need to do, what all those elements are. And that's activity-focused design. Activity-focused design is how we basically study the activities and then design for those activities. And this is probably the most common style of decision-making that we see, maybe second to self-design, in that this is what we do when we go out and do what people refer to as things like user-centered design, where we're going out and conducting research, studying the users, and seeing what's going on. It's where that empathy element comes in. This is a map of Six Flags Magic Mountain, a theme park in the lower part of California. And what's interesting about this map is that they describe everything. They don't leave anything to the imagination. They tell you everything you're going to do. You get this map when you've paid your outrageous ticket price, and they hand it to you in return for your money. And you go into the park, and you turn to the left, and the goal is that you're going to go to every single one of these attractions. And the pattern that happens is pretty much the same. You get into a really, really long line. After the line you get up to the front, you go on a really, really short ride, and then you get really, really sick, and then you go and get in the next really long line, and then you get into the next really short ride, and you continue to get really sick, and that's your day at the park. And it just keeps happening this way, and you keep seeing this. What's interesting about this map is they don't want you to miss a thing. So everything is called out. Everything is there. You can check it all off. It's all about seeing all the details. Now compare this map to the map of the Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World. The thing about the Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World is that they don't call out the rides. Sure, if you know the architecture of Space Mountain, then you can pick it right off the map. But if you don't know the architectural aspects of the individual rides, it's pretty much meaningless to you. You don't know what those things are. It's not that Disney doesn't have rides. They have great rides, and they have as many rides as Six Flags does. It's just that they don't think about it that way. They think about it completely differently. The way Disney approaches this is you're going on an adventure. Let's say you go to Disney World with a 6-year-old. Your adventure probably starts with something known as the character breakfast. The character breakfast is a chance for you and your 6-year-old to get up close and personal with what is, in essence, a creepy guy in an animal suit. And from that point, you continue to make what will be the most expensive breakfast you will ever pay for. But even though it's an expensive breakfast, you're going to love it. You're going to love it because your 6-year-old loves it. And even the creepy guy in the animal suit seems to love it. Everybody loves it. And that's just the start of your day, because you then go and you wander into the park and you have one adventure after another. And there doesn't seem to be any seams to these adventures. You really just sort of experience everything. It all just sort of flows. And eventually, by the end of the day, suddenly, wherever you're standing, the skies erupt, and you sit through what is, in fact, the longest fireworks show you will ever attend. And what's amazing about it is that even though the fireworks is erupting over the park, no matter where you're standing, it seems just perfectly right, because they have somehow mastered the space-time continuum, and the sound that's coming out of the speakers is exactly synchronized with the fireworks that you're seeing. Excuse me. And so there's this entire experience of just hearing and seeing everything perfectly, no matter where you are. So you don't have to get to the right spot. They just made every spot you're at the right spot. And that's how Disney thinks about things. And of course, you take your 6-year-old and you put them on your shoulder because they're exhausted, and you go back not to your hotel, because Disney does not have hotels. Disney has resorts. You go back to your resort and you open the door only to find that while you were gone, someone had come in and made little origami animals out of your towels. This is how Disney thinks of things, right? There is no return on investment on origami towel animals. They create an adventure. And so we can break this down and we can say that Six Flags is about the activities, but Disney is about the experience. And that's what we can do when we move beyond activity-focused design. We can start to think about what happens not just in the specific activities, but what happens in the gaps between the activities. And that is experience-focused design. Now, there was a time in our nation's history where we were going through this rough patch. And that was the moment when it was really hard during the holiday seasons to get your hands on a Nintendo Wii. And at that period, we were doing a bunch of studies on e-commerce sites, and we were having people come in and buy things that they needed and asking them to make purchases of things they needed. And participant after participant after participant was coming in looking for Nintendo Wiis, and they couldn't buy them, and they were really, really frustrated. And one day we had a participant come in, and we happened to put them on the Best Buy site, and sure enough, they were able to. The Best Buy site said for the first time in the entire study we have Nintendo Wiis. And not only do they say they have Nintendo Wiis, they have this feature on the site that says you can pick it up at your local store, and sure enough, the local store had Nintendo Wiis. And this was like the happiest participant we'd ever met. And they were able to breeze through the website. It was stunning how they breezed through the website. And they were able to go in and find the product that they wanted, bring the product into the shopping cart, make the purchase, the whole thing. The transaction took almost no time. It was fantastic. The last part of the transaction involved printing out this sheet of paper. And the sheet of paper said, okay, we've got your Wii. Just give us 2 hours for the store to get it ready, then come up to the store and we'll give it to you. So the participant takes that piece of paper and bounces out of the lab, the happiest we've ever had a user, and apparently goes out to lunch, grabs some lunch, and then heads up to the store and gets to the store, bounces into the store with this incredible gait and peppiness in their step, and walks up to the Best Buy service counter where there's a person behind the counter wearing a blue shirt. I don't know if you know about the Best Buy employees, but the technical name for those people are blue shirts. And that's their job title. You're going to be a blue shirt. And so walks up to the blue shirt behind the counter, hands them the piece of paper. The person does what any good customer service person does. They proceed to type the entire contents into the computer in front of them. And then she gets a frown on her face, and she looks at our participant, and she says, "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have any Wiis." It turns out that morning there was a line for people outside the store waiting for Wiis, and the general manager saw the orders come in and decided to give it to the people waiting instead of waiting for the people who'd ordered it on the website. Right. So, as you imagine, our dude was disappointed. And then to add insult to injury, the blue-shirted lady behind the counter says, "I can't refund your money. That's a different computer. You have to call the 800 number." So now we can sort of separate this out and say that the activity of ordering online went really well, but the experience of buying a Wii at Best Buy really sucked. And that contrast shows us that activities and experience are very different things. Now let's go back to the hospital. Let's say we're building a lab test system not for just anybody in the hospital, but for the neonatal intensive care unit. Now here's the deal with the NICU. It is this place where tiny souls just barely hang by a thread between life and death. And a moment's delay in an important decision could cost a family an incredible loss. So the design of the systems have to be taken with extreme care. So we go in and we do our study, and we start asking the doctors and nurses about their lives, and we start to really get to know what's going on there. And we discover some facts, like the nurses have been working at this hospital on average 22 years. Some had been as many as 40, 45 years at the same hospital working in the NICU. Now, these are people who've seen tremendous change in technology over that period. The new system we're putting in is just another system that they've added to that. And they know what they're doing. They understand what has to be done. So whatever system we build, it better take advantage of all that experience and knowledge, and it cannot get in the way of those nurses as they're putting in those blood test orders or bringing up those results. But this same unit, this same intensive care unit, is in a teaching hospital. And because it's in a teaching hospital, it has resident doctors and resident nurses who just got their degrees, who just became a doctor or a nurse. They don't have 22 years of experience. They haven't seen the changes in the system. And nowhere in their classes did it teach them how to order blood tests. And therefore, they will need help. They will need assistance. The system will have to make sure that they don't make mistakes, because a simple slip could cost a life. So how do we build a system that gives tremendous support to the residents and stays completely out of the way of the experienced nurses? Right? So now we have to get into experience-focused design. And when we do that, what we're doing is we're starting with activity-focused design. We break down the activities and who the users are, but then we get into the deeper questions, the questions that involve that empathy that we've been talking about, that involve all of this thoughtfulness and consideration. We have to really spend the time researching this. And that's experience-focused design. When we go and we start to really look at what that entire experience could be. So we have 5 different types of design decisions. We can use any or all of these. We get to choose which one we use at any time. And here's the thing, nobody talks about this. Nobody talks about how there are different ways for us to make decisions. But once we know that those are there, we can add this into our conversation. We can start to say, what do we want to do? But as we've been researching this, we've realized that there's sort of another dimension to this that we need to think about, a dimension that we call rule-based decisions versus informed decisions. This is the University of Pennsylvania website. And I just got to say, right off, I am very proud of these guys, because they did not fall into a trap that a lot of universities fall into when they're designing their website. That trap is called girls under trees. This is the University of Northern Iowa website, and as you can see, there's a very beautiful woman under a tree. We can see the same thing at the University of British Columbia website, also at the Imperial College of London. We can see it at UMass Amherst, at Reed College. We can see it at the University of Virginia, and again at the University of Virginia, and again at the University of Virginia. And we can go over to Lewis and Clark State College. We can see it at William and Mary. We can go to Denmark, we can go to Stockholm, we can go to, I don't know where this is. Outside Amsterdam, I think. This is the University of Brazil. This is in Singapore. This is Israel. Hawaii Pacific University has girls under palm trees. Over at UC San Diego, no girls under trees, but guys with surfboards, which they claim is an introductory physics class. But they didn't do that. Well, when we were talking to the provost there, he was sort of riled up. And he was riled up because this is what the homepage for the UPenn website looks like. And this is what the School of Medicine's homepage looks like. And this is what the School of Nursing Science looks like. And this is the Student Nurses Association here. And this is what the admission system looks like. And this is what the Wharton undergraduate program looks like. This one was cool. It had this interactive thing where you could move around and it would show you these pictures. And wait a second. Go back there. What's that? Uh-oh. Go! I thought we were past that. And the thing that the provost was upset about was that all these sites looked different. They didn't look like they were from the same university. He wanted to be from the same university. And he had a solution. The solution was they were going to put together a set of guidelines. And everyone would follow the guidelines. And if everybody followed the guidelines, it would guarantee that all the sites would look the same. So the way the guidelines were written, they were filled with these rules for which you were to follow to build the site, such as rule number 17. The search box always goes in the upper right. Now, why would we put the search box in the upper right? Well, that's obviously the best place to put it, they said. Okay, so that made us curious. We went out and started to do research. This is Washington Mutual's website, and sure enough, the search box is in the upper right. But they went out of business. Wells Fargo, which is still in business, their search box is in the upper left. Amazon, who's managed to stay in business, is in the middle. And at one point, they had two of them for some reason. Best Buy puts theirs on the left, whereas eBay puts theirs sort of in the middle and then somewhere down in the middle of the page for some reason. The city of Tucson is on the right, while the city of New York is on the left. At some level, that makes sense. Arizona State University was on the right, whereas the University of Miami was on the middle. And here's the thing. Nobody had problems with any of these positions. It worked for every user that we watched. And because it doesn't matter where the search box is as long as it looks like a search box. That's basically it. So it turned out always putting the search box in the upper right was not such a good rule. It didn't matter. And we could do this with every rule they put in the guidelines. It didn't make a difference. So we started to study this, and we went out and we found places that had been making investment in style guides. And we followed those places for several years. And what we found was, after studying dozens of institutions that had built massive style guides and put together all these resources and compiled these rules for everybody to follow, that once you got to about the 2-year point, nobody remembered these things existed. It turned out that nobody was using the style guides. We could not find one instance of a style guide that actually had made it and was used and was determined to actually be producing good quality designs. So all of this energy, all of this effort was for naught, yet people were still doing it. Even though there was no evidence on the planet that these things continue to work, people were still investing in them. And what we realized was that there was this real desire to follow what we call rule-based decisions. It turns out that the hope of the style guide is that you can just give it to anybody. So, at a university, you often have an administrator in the English department maintaining the English department's website. They're not trained in design. Therefore, if we just give them the style guide and they follow the rules, administrators are good at following rules. If we just give them the style guide to do that, they'll be able to create something decent. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be good, right? So they can produce something good. That's the idea, except that it never works. And the opposite of that is that we have to teach that administrator how to do basic design. We have to teach them how to make decisions, and the way to do that is to give them informed decisions, to actually be able to let them make decisions based on the experiences that they've had. But the problem with this here is that that requires thinking. You see, the thing about rule-based design is that it really prevents thinking. We don't want people to think. We just want them to follow the rules. It's a fascist notion of things, which works for short periods of time but doesn't work over the long run. Informed decisions require thinking. Rule-based designs work fine until you run into an exception case. Then what do you do? But if you have been trained in understanding how design works, suddenly you can deal with those exception cases because you know how to make the decisions. So it turns out that this dichotomy between rule-based decisions and informed decisions really sort of helped us understand that there's this basic conundrum that we have to deal with. So how do we go about informing design? Well, we started to study companies, two types of companies. Companies that were really great at getting fabulous designs that their users loved out all the time. And then we would find a direct competitor who was really struggling at getting good design out. And we had about 20 of these pairs. And we went in and we talked to the teams and we studied their designs and we had users use their products and services and we compared what was different between the organizations and tried to find patterns that emerged. And what we found was interesting, that you could take the way people design and you could put it on a spectrum. And in the middle of that spectrum, we draw a process. Now, the process is the series of steps we use to get things done. And if we got something done, we had a process. One of the interesting things is when we would talk to people at the companies that were always failing, they would say, well, our problem is that we don't have a process. We don't have a good process for doing this. But they did, because they were putting things out. They were getting products shipped. They were getting their services built. If they did that, they had to have a process. A process is like a recipe. It's a series of steps that you do to get things done. It's like what Ahava was talking about earlier. The thing about the process is that you don't have to realize you're following it. My mother was an amazing cook. And one of my favorite dishes that she made was her chicken paprikash. And what made the chicken paprikash so wonderful was that she just knew how to make it. For years, once I learned how to cook myself, I would ask her for the recipe. And she said, I don't have a recipe. I learned it from my grandmother. She learned it from her grandmother. I don't have a recipe for this. But here's the deal. If I were to sit next to her while she was cooking, which I did, and I were to write down every ingredient she put in, which I did, and I were to take note in all the activities that she did with those ingredients, which I did, I would end up with a recipe, which I did. And my mother, being my mother, the first time I did that, looked at the recipe and looked in the pot and took a spoon and tasted it and said, this isn't very good. I'll get you a better recipe. That's a process, right? But what people are often talking about when they say process, is what they really mean is a methodology. A methodology is a repeatable process. A process is something you might just do once. You may never repeat it. You may never want to repeat it because it was so horrible. But a methodology, you repeat. And the thing about a methodology is that it can be informal. An informal methodology is, hey, did you see what those guys just did? We should do it that way. To a formal methodology. The most formal you can make a methodology is to give it a 4-letter acronym, put it in a notebook, and build a consulting practice around it. And it can be anything on that spectrum there. But the whole idea of a methodology is to have a way to repeatably produce results. And we found that lots of organizations had methodologies. But we also found that there was this other thing that was not a methodology and not a process, but sort of fell into that category. And it didn't have a good name, so we had to come up with one. And so we came up with the name dogma. Dogma is a belief that people have about how they do stuff. And you've all heard dogma. Carl was talking earlier about agile versus waterfall. We've talked about object-oriented design, content strategy, web standards. There are web standards people who believe in their dogma so much they remove all the tables from their house. They eat breakfast on divs. And these are people who just believe that if we just do it the right way, we will get it done. It will be awesome, right? But notice that there's a whole area here, over here on the left, that is open. And it was interesting. What we found there was something different than methodology and dogma. What we found was that there were other types of things, and one of them we call techniques. Now, I said that a process is a series of steps. A technique is the thing you do in one of those steps. So let's go back to cooking. If you've ever cooked a gravy or a sauce or a soup, you may have made a roux. A roux is a basic technique of cooking. You basically take flour and oil and you cook it over low heat. And the thing about making a roux is the first time you go to do it, you will probably screw it up. It takes the right amount of flour and the right amount of oil and the right temperature of heat, and you have to stir it exactly the right amount. If you get the heat too high, it'll burn, and if it's too low or you don't stir it enough, it'll get lumpy, and it's really precise, and you have to really understand how your stove works, how your pot works, how the oil and the flour works. It takes practice. But after you've done it a few times, you get good at it. There's nothing magical about making a roux, it just takes practice. And that's what techniques are. Techniques are things that we do, and we get better at them the more we do them. And the first time we do them, we probably screw them up. But as we were doing our research, we found that there was something off to the left of technique, something that was out there that wasn't quite a technique. And again, we didn't have a good name for it, so we called it a trick. And a trick is basically a technique that you use the wrong way to get something useful done. The best example I have of this is that a few months ago I needed to call a plumber. And it occurred to me that while I was calling the plumber, never once did I ask them what their methodology was. I don't even know what a plumber would say if you asked them what their methodology is. Well, we're currently using the waterfall method. But in the next few weeks, we're going to be moving over to a more object-oriented methodology where we treat every drip as its own object. And we just send it a message that says, fix yourself. I don't know what they'd say. Instead, what happened was the plumber drove up in a truck into my driveway, and I went out to meet him, and he got out of the truck, and he went into the back, and he opened up the back of the truck where I could plainly see there was all this stuff that looked like it had just come fresh from the Spanish Inquisition. And he took a subset of the things in the truck, and he put them into a box, a toolbox. And he brought the toolbox into the house, and we went into the basement to where the leak was occurring. And he rummaged through the toolbox as he was looking at the leak. He rummaged through the toolbox, and he pulled out a tool, and he started banging on the pipe. And I asked him, I said, how did you know that was the tool that you would need to fix this? He says, I didn't really. I said, is that the right tool? He says, no, not really. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm paying this guy $700,000 an hour. And I say, why aren't we using the right tool? He says, well, I don't really feel like going out to the truck. Right? Sometimes, that's what a trick is. Sometimes it's not worth it to go out to the truck and get the right tool, because by the time you'd gotten there and gotten back, you would be done. That's what a trick is. A trick is something that is the wrong way to do it, but it's so fast and easy that it just gets the job done anyways. And this is the full spectrum of how people work. What we found when we studied the companies that were really successful and compared them to the companies that were always struggling, we found that the struggling companies often relied on methodology and dogma. They were constantly focused on methodology and dogma. They were the ones putting out the style guides. They were the ones trying to make the rules and get everybody focused. And every time their projects failed, their first reaction was to make more methodology and more dogma. and to just keep in this sort of deepening, darkening death spiral of methodology and dogma, because they were just focused that there had to be a formula that got it right. But what was fascinating was the companies that were successful, our hypothesis was that they would have methodology and dogma too, and that they just found the right stuff. And what we found was that they didn't. They ignored that side altogether. There was one company that had a methodology, an official methodology for their development process. But they also had a vice president whose job it was to go from group to group to group to tell them, don't tell anyone else, but you guys are excluded from the methodology. Just do what it takes to get it done. He told this to every group. He just told them not to tell each other that he told this to every group. That was how they dealt with it. They didn't have that. Instead, what they did was they focused on making sure their teams were as knowledgeable as possible on tricks and techniques. They were constantly learning new tricks, they were constantly learning new techniques, and they were constantly experimenting and practicing them. And they found out the bigger they got the toolbox, the better it was. Now, dogma and methodology, those are basically rule-based decision-making ideas. But tricks and techniques, that requires informed decision-making. And that informed stuff comes from the constant experimentation with the tools, with the tricks. And that the teams that had all of the tools and tricks at their disposal were more likely to succeed than the ones that didn't. So that turned out to be key. So basically what we have is this idea here that style guides and guidelines, they fall into this idea of rule-based decisions, but something like design patterns or a design system, that falls into informed decisions. And what makes these different, even though they look very much the same, is how they're used in the process. You see, something like design patterns, which look like they could be a style guide, just when you look at them, it's not about their presentation where they're telling you how the design gets used and where it gets used. It's how they're enforced. In style guides, you must follow the rules. In design patterns, like this design pattern from Salesforce, you are asked to think about using this, but you don't have to. But they do have one rule, and the rule is if you're going to do something different, if you're not going to use the patterns we already have, then you have to write up your own pattern and put it in the library and explain why you would use this instead of something else. And what happens is the pattern library keeps growing, and the expertise of the organization gets better. Some patterns hardly get used at all. Other patterns get used all the time. When people run into things where the rules don't make sense, they just come up with their own pattern. But if the rules make sense, they can use the pattern in the library. In fact, that's the easiest thing to do. Many pattern libraries and design systems go so far as to give you the code. So all you have to do is identify what the elements are, and the code is right there for you. That means good design is the path of least resistance. And that's how you make informed decisions, by having a system underlying it that supports that. Now, given all this, we're back to our 5 types of decision styles, and we get to choose which ones we want. So we might use unintentional design if we're just whipping this one-shot thing off to a handful of people and it doesn't really make much sense to invest a lot to make sure anybody can use it. But if, people are starting to complain about it, then we have to eat our own dog food, and from that point, what we do is go to self-design and start designing for ourselves, getting it right that way. And if it turns out that we need to learn about our users more to become geniuses at this, then we can use a technique like usability testing, where we go in and watch people use our designs and learn what they do. Or maybe what we need to do is go out into the field and see who's using this and how they use it. And that would be activity-focused design. Or maybe we need to focus on things like personas and design patterns to come up with experience-focused design. So the tools that we have support all of these different things. But not every tool supports everything, so we need to understand how the tools relate to the decision styles that we're using. Now, there are just a few other things that we found that were really interesting when we started to research this. First, every style has a purpose. So it's not like one is better than the other. The question is, how do you match it to the job you're trying to get done? The farther we go to the right, the more expensive they get. So we have to ask ourselves, is it worth it? The other thing we saw was that the best designers we met, they knew which style they were using. Of course, they didn't know them by name because we made a lot of these names up. This was the Gray's Anatomy problem. There was no definition before we started looking at this. But they knew they were doing this. It turned out that Jason Fried knew that they were doing what we called self-design. And David Poteet knew that what they were doing was what we called genius design. So they knew this inherently, and they were happy that we'd given what they did a name and some legitimacy, because they thought they were cheating. But the other interesting thing that came out of this was that they used the same style for an entire project. Now, a project goes from ideation through its delivery. So they would make sure that if they were going to use something like self-design, they didn't change midstream before they shipped to activity-focused design. Right? And that's key, right? Because once you start going down a road, you can't shift the goals. If I'm making it based on data because I'm doing activity-focused design, I can't suddenly then say, well, but I wouldn't use that, and to shift to self-design. I need to decide I'm building it for the users or I'm building it for me or whatever it is, but I have to stick with that. Similarly, everyone on the team has to use the same style. If one person is building it with activity-focused design, that means they're using user data. Whereas if they're building it for self-design, another person's building it for self-design, that means they're building it for themselves, and those are going to conflict once they try to come together. The most obvious evidence of this is what we call the executive seagull maneuver. That's when an executive comes in, swoops down over the design, poops all over it, and then swoops away. That poop and swoop maneuver really happens because the executive is not in tune with the style that the team has been using, and therefore has launched into self-design or worse, spouse design. My wife would do it this way. She uses Amazon all the time. We should have search. She always uses search on Amazon. Yes, but we're making a dishwasher. I don't understand where search comes in. No, it should have it. Everything should have search. What if we make it just like Google? We just put a big search box in the middle. Okay, but it's an email application. I don't understand. So that is key. The more advanced the style, the more expensive it gets. So we have to decide based on what we want to spend. I mean, ideally, we would do experience-based design all the time, but not every project warrants that kind of investment. It's very expensive to go there. And unintentional design is by far the cheapest, but most projects don't warrant that either. So we have to pick something in the middle, and we have to find where that's going to fit. And here's the thing. What we've learned is agencies really can't go beyond genius design. They can do self-design and genius design really well. They can do a little bit of activity-focused design. But really, activity-focused design and experience-focused design have to be done in-house. They have to be owned by someone in-house because the investment that it takes means that you can't have the all that knowledge and experience walk out the door the minute the project ends. So an agency can do self-design, and a lot of agencies do, and they do fantastic jobs of building the sites they would want to use and giving that to their clients. And the clients who really don't have a whole stake in the game basically say, yeah, that looks great. So picking an agency that is like your users is a great way to go about it. Similarly, if they march into a particular area, let's say restaurant websites, and they really get to know the restaurant owner and how the menus work and how the customers work, they can make a killing building out great restaurant websites and sell that in a lot of places. That's genius design. But it's going to be very hard for an agency to get any foothold in activity-focused or experience-focused design, because that's really got to be driven in-house. It doesn't mean they can't help, but the focus comes from inside. And finally, the more advanced the style, the better the design at the end. To this point, 37 Signals realized that they had reached limits by designing for themselves. They then went out and conducted research with their users for functions they didn't use themselves. And that led to the redesign of their newest Basecamp version. That was all driven by research that they conducted, visiting their users, seeing them actually use it in ways that they never imagined people used it. And the product was a bigger hit. It was even more successful. So that growth for them was a huge admission that just designing for themselves was the only option. So here's the deal. The question then becomes, what kind of designer do you aspire to be? Because it turns out you get to choose what type of environment you work in. If you are looking for design work, you can actually, in the interview process, figure out if an organization is more self-design or more activity-focused design or experience-focused design, and decide where you want to work. Similarly, if you're hiring designers, you can actually find out, do they tend to design for themselves? Do they use research data? How do they go about the design process? So you can match positions and get the right match. If you get the wrong match, it's going to be tension and hell. So you really want to get the right match. And the reality is that this is not hard. This is not rocket science. I know this for a fact because NASA is one of our clients, and they have a very specific definition of what rocket science is. And this is not it. They suggested it was brain surgery. And we checked with our client at the Mayo Clinic, and they have pretty much told us it's definitely not brain surgery. So we now think it's pool cleaning. But possibly pool cleaning involving robots. So, what do you aspire to be? Where do you want to be? What kind of job do you want to have? Start with the types of decisions you want to make. And that's what I came to talk to you about. There are 5 types of styles: unintended design, self-design, genius design, activity-focused design, and experience-focused design. You want to encourage informed decisions in your teams, stay away from rule-based decision-making, and finally, look towards adopting as many tricks and techniques. Don't spend so much time focusing on methodologies and dogma. Find the right techniques for your needs. If for some reason you found this the least bit interesting, I've written a lot about this topic, so you can check out our website at uie.com. If you work in design and we're not connected on LinkedIn, I want to encourage you to do that. I love reaching out to people who are in the design field, and I found LinkedIn is a great way to connect up and expand my ability to connect with folks. So please do that. And finally, you can follow me on the Twitters where I tweet about design, design education, design strategy, and the amazing customer service practices of the airline industry. That's what I came to talk to you about.
Thank you very much for encouraging my behavior.
Thank you.